Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Adobe XD Masterclass. My name is Howard Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe. Hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon. If you are tuning in live here on Behance, let me know in the chat who you are and where you're tuning in from. We've got Mailey and Wade and Alon and Masayu, Laura, Jack, Katarina, Colby, Abdullah, Arshad. Great to see all of you. You're all excited for the weekend. I was just frantically dealing with tech issues. Nothing was working, so hopefully my audio sounds okay. Hopefully the video looks okay. Everything was just blowing up in my face until the last possible moment. We'll see if it holds. Last week we had some tech issues as well, but so far so good, I hope. All right, let's go ahead and hop over to my screen and we are going to get going with Masterclass number 103. Exciting stuff. On our way to 200 eventually. All right. If you have been following me on Twitter or Dribbble or various platforms, you may have noticed that over the course of July, I was releasing UI kits and sample files almost every day. I was hoping to get to 31, but life caught up. But I got to, I think, 23, which isn't bad. And I'm going to continue releasing them as time goes on. But a lot of you wanted to see how many of these were made. And today we are going to be creating tables. I know, tables are not very exciting. They're kind of boring, but there's something that many of us designers have to design on a sometimes daily basis. And I think this is an interesting example because it takes something that's typically not the greatest looking element in the world, and I'm going to show you how to kind of style it so that it looks somewhat decent. We're going to be adding some interaction using radio buttons and hover effects and all sorts of fun stuff. We're also going to be using stacks and padding, responsive resize, and a whole lot of components. So that being said, let's go ahead and hop over to Adobe XD. And where is my window? I lost my window already. Here. Boop. Here we go. All right. Now, considering this isn't really made for a specific screen, we're going to start off with a web 1920 by 1080 pixel artboard. But of course, if you are designing for a mobile device or a specific web or desktop experience, you can definitely choose the preset that fits your design. All right, let's go ahead and get going. Now, if you remember on the design that I just showed a few moments ago, the background was light, but it wasn't pure white. It had a little bit of blue in there. You can also use a little bit of gray as well, but if you're going dark mode, definitely switched up a little bit. And the reason I'm doing that is because the container for the main content is going to be pretty much pure white. So by dropping the color a little bit on the background, it'll allow it to blend in a little bit less than it would before. We're also going to be using shadows and so on and so forth. Hey, Samuel and Jennifer, great to see you. So with the artboard selected, I'm going to pop open the fill and we're going to swivel it over to the blues. And then, like I mentioned, just add a little bit of something, right? Just like that. Hey, Kasoon, great to see you as well. Right? There we go. All right, now we're going to start creating the actual table. And the bulk of it is going to be created using basically two parts, a header and then also the main content. And this will allow us to really start using stacks and padding to our advantage. So we're going to start with the header. And I'm going to grab the rectangle tool, shortcut key R, and draw one out. And we'll start with about this, but we may need to adjust the size and the width and the height as we go. In terms of the color, we might want a nice vibrant color for the header to really make it stand out. So I'm going to switch it over to blues and we'll do something like this. We have to keep in mind that we're going to have text on top of it. So you want a background that is going to contrast really well with that text. And someone's asking, what are we going to be designing? And we are going to be designing tables. Like I mentioned, tables are not very exciting, but something that we all, I think I'm losing my voice, something that we all design once in a while, right? Now, knowing that we're going to have another section down here that's going to kind of extend down this way, we may want rounded corners, but we don't necessarily want the rounded corners on the bottom edges of this header, right? So we only want the rounded corners on the top left and the top right. So within the properties inspector over to the right, we can go ahead and enter values, or we can use our handles to pull in the corners. Let's try about, I think 8 might be a little bit too little. It's not bad. We probably don't want rounded corners that are too round, right? Because then it looks a little bit awkward. But of course, if you're going for that style, definitely go in that direction. But what we can do now is, now that we have all the corners rounded, we can hold down our Alt or Option key and drag one back, right? And drag another one, just like that, right? So now we have nice sharp corners at the bottom of this header, which will allow us to create another section in just a moment that will flow really nicely. Right? All right, now in terms of the content, we're going to have a few different columns. And of course, this is going to change based on what your tables are designed for, right? This one's going to be very generic. We're going to have some like an employee, position, location, maybe favorite typeface just for fun, and then some action icons at the end. So we're going to grab the text tool, shortcut key T. I'm going to click and type out employee. Now let's talk a little bit about the actual text. Because obviously our default is gray and it's Helvetica. Probably don't want that, right? We want something that's going to contrast well with the blue in the background. We also want, a nice, little bit more of a stylized typeface, but not too stylized, right? So we're going to start with the fill. Swivel it to white, right? Contrasts really nicely with the blue in the background. And if we hop over to our plugins, and I go to a plugin like Stark, it's going to let me know, that, oh, you have to sign in now. Oh, okay. That's new. They must have just updated that. But if I were to sign in, I'd be able to see the contrast, and the white on the blue should pass the majority of contrasts. All right. Can you experiment with responsive resize? Yes. So once we start working on this table, we will definitely experiment with responsive resize a little bit. All right. In terms of the typeface, Helvetica New is not terrible, right? I definitely use it in some cases, especially if I'm designing for the web. But something like Forma DJR is a pretty decent typeface for something like this. It's very clean, it works really well, and it's available on Adobe fonts, right? So if you look up Forma, you should be able to see all the different Forma DJR family, right? And this one that we're going to be using is the Forma DJR text. And you can also use something like Astoria, which I've been using quite a bit lately. Right? That's also a nice typeface. I think it kind of works. Maybe I'll go for Astoria. Very subtle, right? But I think it works. And I might, considering this is the header, I might want to bump up the weight a little bit. I think bold might be too much, possibly. But the nice thing about using character styles is we can add this, and we're going to do that in a second, and we'll be able to very easily update them throughout the entire header. So let's start with bold. Again, I think it might be too bold, but let's press play at the top just to, yeah, it's a bit too. So I think I'm going to bump it down to about medium, and we now have our first header. Now, 20 might be a little bit too large, considering we're going to have a few headers going across this section. So I'm going to drop it down to about 18. And I want to make sure, like I mentioned, to save this as a character style. And that will allow me, again, to update just once, and it'll push those changes everywhere. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pop this about here. We will change the position a little bit later on. And over here, we're going to have something like position. And then we'll have location. Favorite typeface, because why not, right? And then actions. And this will go towards the end. And underneath this, in the main section, there'll be a bunch of icons to do things like edit and share and delete and so on and so forth, right? Now, one more thing we're going to add before I start talking about alignment and distribution is over to the left, we might want a checkbox. Because I know that in my table design, we're going to have some checkboxes going down. For each row is going to have a checkbox to select an employee. And often on tables, you'll see at the very top, there'll be another checkbox that will essentially allow you to select all, right? So we're going to do something similar up there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my ellipse tool and draw one out. Now you might be thinking, why are you drawing out an ellipse if you want to create a checkbox or a radio button, right? And that is because we're actually going to be creating a squircle, one of my favorite words and favorite shapes. Of course, you could do something simple like a rectangle and maybe round out the corners a little bit. You could do that, right? Boring. So I'm going to go ahead and select my ellipse, and then in my plugins, I'm going to be using the Super Ellipse plugin, and I'm simply going to round this out a little bit. Say about 40. And then in terms of the styling, we're going to keep it very simple. We're going to turn off the fill, and we're going to change the border to white, and then so it's nice and visible, and it almost matches the weight of the text. We're going to bump up the size. It might be too large. I'll drop it down a little bit. And there we go. We now have, let's try 3. Is that too much? That's not too bad. Now we now have our checkbox, right? Beautiful. All right, that could work. All right, going back to what I was about to get to just a moment ago, alignment and distribution. Now, one thing you might immediately try, right? Let's put that over there and make sure it lines up, is you might grab the first one, select all the other text layers. Should actually probably position this down here somewhere, right? I'm going to select all these text layers. And the first thing I might want to do is just align them all so that they are horizontally, or is that horizontally, right? Vertical, line the middle. Now, what you might initially do, right, is you might press this button right over here, which will distribute horizontal. And that's going to look at the first text layer, the last text layer, and then make sure that all the other ones in between are distributed evenly. Now, the problem with this is in some cases this will work, but in other cases, you might have certain columns that will naturally be much larger. Some will be naturally a little bit smaller, right? Some may just be filled with numbers. Some may be much longer, like favorite typefaces, for example. So once we actually start adding the content down below, we may find ourselves going back up to the header and just moving some a little bit more than others. And you'll often see this in tables just to give a little bit more room for things like favorite typeface, which might be longer than something like position or location, right? So we'll definitely get back to this in just a moment. But I'm going to select all this information here. I'm going to group it, Command and Control G, and I'll call this header. Ooh. All right, so we have our header. And now we want to start working on the content down below. And we're going to start again with a rectangle, just like this, right? Now, because we're going to be using padding and stacks in this particular section, we're not too concerned about the height because ideally, as we design, it's going to automatically resize, which is wonderful, right? So I'm going to turn off the border. And what you might be noticing is that even though, we're working with a pure white for this container and the background is, it's light, but there's a little bit of color in it and it's not as bright, it still kind of blends in just a touch, right? So what I'm going to do to help with this is I'm going to actually be adding a drop shadow. And we're going to keep this very subtle, right? We don't want something like this. This isn't 1999. We're going to keep the shadow very subtle. So we're going to bump it down a little bit. Let's try about 10. And we're definitely going to blur it quite a bit. Let's try about 24. And considering our background is a little bit blue, right? We're going to add a little bit of blue in there. Just like that. And maybe drop the opacity a touch, just so we have a nice subtle shadow. And then very similar to the header, we may want to round out the corners. But in this case, it's not the top and, top left and top right. It's the bottom left and bottom right. So to keep it consistent, right, the header at the top, we rounded it 8 pixels. So we're going to go to this shape here, and we're going to round out the bottom right and the bottom left by 8 pixels. And there we go. Perfect. All right, what we're going to do now is we're going to start creating our first row. I'm going to make sure to name this container. Put this down there. I can also name it background or all sorts of different things. And we're going to start adding some content. Now, the first thing, underneath the checkbox at the top, we're going to want a checkbox or a radio button down here, right? So I can actually dive in here, copy this layer, which I'm going to name check, and paste it. Now, of course, because it's white, we definitely want to make a change so that we can see it, right? And I'm going to change this to a nice darker color with a little bit of blue in it. I might want to bring back the size a touch and increase it a little bit as well, just like that, right? Now, in just a moment, we're actually going to be creating a component from this checkbox so that we have two different states, a toggled state and an inactive state, as you can see here, right? Now, down below employee, which I'm going to move over just a little bit to give me a little bit more room, we're going to have more or less, a few pieces of information. We're going to have the profile, possibly an online status, or are they online, offline, away, busy, that sort of thing. And then we're going to have a name and probably an email address, right? So we're going to start with our profile, and just to keep consistency, we have our squircle going on, right? So I'm going to, oops, I'm in the wrong section. Ellipse. There we go. And I can also start dragging out some guides just to help me line things up if I wanted to. But again, we're going to go through the process of lining things up a little bit later once we know how much information is actually going to be in each row, right? Back to my super ellipse. Round it out just a little bit. Maybe we'll stick with 40. And then for these, we're going to add in some avatars. Now, of course, you can get your avatars from Finder. You can grab them from the internet somewhere. Or, I do have some in my Creative Cloud library. I have my toy faces. So maybe I'll just grab this toy face here and boop, pop it. All right. Now, I did mention that we may also want to show whether this user is online, offline, busy, away, that sort of thing. So we can grab our ellipse one more time, draw one out. Now, for this one, we probably don't need to convert it into a squircle, right? So we'll change the color. Maybe this user is online. Do a nice green. We'll add a little bit of a border to match the background, just to separate a touch. And that looks pretty good right about there, right? Now, over to the right of this profile, we're going to want some information, including the name and maybe an email address. So we'll start with the name. We'll want to make sure that we have a nice dark color. Now, we were using this color over here for this, our darker gray blue type of thing. So I'm going to actually make sure to add this to my colors. Boop. There we go. That way I can just very easily use this throughout my project. Now that might be a little bit too large, I'm thinking. So I'm gonna just drop this a touch to about 16. I think medium might be okay for the name, but then down below we might want our, possibly an email address, right? So maybe howard@pinsky.xyz. And this will be secondary information. So we're gonna probably, drop the size a little bit more and then drop the weight possibly. Maybe. It might be a little bit too much, so maybe we'll stick with medium. But what we can do to also signify that it's secondary information is drop the color a little bit. You can either do that by dropping the opacity, or you can just pull up the color like this, right? I think that can work. And then we're going to make sure that it lines up with our profile. Maybe move it on in a little bit. And that could work, right? And now we're starting to kind of see how the headers at the top will definitely need to kind of shift around, because we now have position right underneath or right above part of the employee information, right? So we're going to definitely have to move that. And what I can do, now I can start kind of setting up our padding, right? So if I dive in here, let's take a look at this. We have 32, well, it's a weird number, right? I'm gonna get rid of the decimals. And let's go for just 30 and 30. All right. And I'm going to start selecting some of this information, and I'm going to start grouping some of it. And this will be user and check. And I'm going to group this, and I'll call this row. Now what this is going to allow me to do is it's going to allow me to select a lot of this information here, place it all into a group called tables, or table I should say. And then I can turn on padding. So this will allow me, if we do go ahead and change the size of the header, right? Oops, I should also, on the header, enable padding as well, right? I can dive in there and it's going to move this over, right? And I want to make sure that, so padding is turned on. I also need a background on my table, which should be this one here. Let me unpad this for a second. Move this up, round this out by 8. Turn padding on. There we go. I think that worked a little bit. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so I had to define the background a little bit better than I did previously. Perfect. And that works. All right. So we're going to start moving some of this information around a little bit, but again, we're going to have to go back up and make some changes a little bit later. But inside of this row one more time, we're going to start wanting our position, right? So I'm going to grab my rectangle, draw one out, and we're also going to be using padding on this element as well. I'm going to line this up here. Maybe I'll round out the corners just a little bit. Now, even though we were using 8 pixels for the rounded corners on the overall table, we probably don't want to do 8 on a much smaller element like this, right? We want to probably bump it back to about 4. And then maybe for this label, depending on the position, the color may actually change. So maybe for this first one, we might want to do something like a nice blurple or a purplish blue, right? And then on the inside, we're going to write design. And we'll just use a nice white color. That could work. And then to help us with our padding, I'm going to go ahead and select the text layer and the container in the background. I'm going to group it, Command and Control G, and I'll call this label. And then I want to make sure that padding is turned on within the Properties Inspector. And this will allow me to define the padding around the text layer, right? So obviously we don't want as much padding on the right-hand side, right? So I'm going to bring that back to about 10. We can definitely experiment with the values, but I think that looks not too bad. Maybe I'll bump this down a touch, and that looks pretty good right about. So the nice thing is when we do get around to adding another one, let's say a product manager, right? That background is going to automatically resize as we're working on it. And I might also want, just knowing that I'm going to have a lot of these labels throughout this table and possibly other tables, I might want to turn this into a component. So Command and Control K to turn it into a component. And now I have it saved in my document assets. All right, that looks pretty good. And now over to the right, we're going to add maybe our location. So we might start off with something like, let's say Toronto, Ontario, and then possibly even we may want a little bit of an icon to just really tell the users that this is a location, right? So if we hop over to our plugins one more time, we can hop into the icons for design plugin and look up something like location. There we go. There's a nice little location pin. This plugin always throws icons wherever it pleases. The one thing I don't like about this plugin, I don't know why it does that. And I might want to just bump up this color a little bit so it's not too dark. Something like that. Maybe even a little bit lighter. Is it too small? Too small. The life of a designer. Very simple tweaks, just to make sure that things aren't too small or too big. I think that could work. I'm going to group that. Call this location. And then over here, we're going to work on our favorite typeface. And of course, we're going to want Comic Sans. Because why not, right? There we go. And then finally, over to the right, to finish off this row, we're going to want some action. And this, again, like I mentioned earlier, this might be things like edit or share, delete, and maybe even a menu icon to access additional information. So I'm going to very quickly go back to my plugins and let's try edit, see if we have any. No. I can also open up Nucleo, which I've used several times throughout these streams, and it's a third-party icon manager that I use to just store all the icons that I've either purchased or have been given throughout the years. And I have a lot of icons. Not all of them are in here. So I've noticed as you add more and more icons, it just gets a little bit sluggy. I try to keep it to the sets that I use regularly. That's not too bad. We have our edit, and then we might want like a trash icon. And that was from 4, I think it was. So let's see if they have, it's not the greatest looking icon in the world, but to keep consistency, we're gonna run with it. And then we might want some sort of a share icon. And then we'll probably also want a menu icon. Now the menu icon, there are 2 ways you can do this, right? I mean, there are a million ways you can do this. You can have the 3 dots that kind of go horizontally, but because we're kind of running out of space already, it might make sense to have the 3 dots go vertically, right? So if I go ahead and draw out maybe 1 dot like this, two, and then 3, right? Something like that. It might be a little bit too large. Maybe I'll just drop it to about 4 pixels each, right? That could potentially work. I think the colors might be a bit too dark, but we're going to run with it for now. We can always make changes later. And I want to make sure that all of these are nicely spaced out. We'll do about 16. Go. Select all of these. We're going to group them. We'll call them actions. And they might be a bit too large. Turn off responsive resize. They're border based, aren't they? I'm going to go ahead and object, path, and then outline stroke. Go. And that should allow me to resize a little bit better. These guys here are still a little bit strong. I don't know why it does that. I don't. 4 and then 4. Is that too much? That's not too much. All right, that'll do. I don't want to spend too much time on these action icons, but I think that will do, right? So we have this one over here, which is about 20 from the left. Not a great number, especially if we're going with the 8-pixel grid, but we're going to run with it. And then we have 20 from that side. We want to make sure that these all line up. So we're going to dive in here, position this over, and I might just want to bring this back a touch. There we go. All right, that looks like it sort of lines up. All right, so we've gone ahead and completed our first row. I think the alignment and distribution is not perfect, but I think it's going to work for now. And actually looking at this, I think I made them too small actually. But we're going to run with it. possibly a bit small. That's okay. You get the idea. All right, so we have our first row. Now, one thing that we're going to probably want to do at some point is put a hover effect behind all this information. We'll get to that in a little bit. But what we want to do now is we want to go through and we want to create our interaction for our radio button, right? So we're going to have two states. We're going to have our inactive state, which or unselected state, and then a toggle state for selected. So what we're going to do is we're going to press the plus button within the properties inspector to create our component. And knowing that there'll be a little bit of animation between the two different states, what I want to do is actually select this object, duplicate it, bring it in a little bit, switch it over to a fill, and I'll just maybe sample this blue. And this will let users know that it is selected, right? But in the first state, we want it a little bit smaller, and we also don't want it to be seen, right? So we're going to take the opacity and drag it down to 0. And then if we go ahead and press that plus button one more time, we can now create a toggle state. And of course, you can create a new state as well, or you can even create a hover state if you wanted to, just to kind of add a little bit of something there. Probably not necessary. So we're going to create a toggle state. And then here, we want to make 2 changes, probably 3. We want to first bring the opacity of that dot in the middle up to 100%. We want to enlarge it. And then we also want to change the border color of the overall shape to the same blue, just like that, right? So we have our toggle state and we have our default state, right? And the nice thing about the toggle state is it wires it up by default. So if I go ahead and press play, I can now click and it's going to automatically make that change, right? Which is perfect. All right. That looks pretty good. Now, like I mentioned, we might want something in the background that allows, a little bit of a hover effect. So when someone is moving over top of these rows, it'll just highlight it a little bit, right? So what I'm going to do is inside of this row, I'm going to grab my rectangle and draw one out. Maybe I'll go edge to edge. And just so I can see what we're dealing with, I'm going to maybe drop the opacity a touch just so I line everything up. There we go. Move this up a little bit. All right. Now, there are definitely a few ways we can go about this. Let me actually make this a little bit thicker. So we can do something simple. Let me actually change this to hover. We can do something simple and move it behind all the other elements and basically have a simple hover effect that when you go over top of it, it kind of changes it to something that looks like this, right? Something like this. But one more thing we might want to consider is maybe we want also the text to change color as well, right? And that's, you might think that's very complicated to do, but actually it's not too bad. So here's what we're going to try to follow along with me if you want to do something like this. We actually want 2 elements, right? We want a background and we also want a color change. And I have both of those layers right over here. And we're going to move these around in just a little bit. Actually, let's actually go ahead and place them above everything for now, right? Now, the background is going to be what is going to appear when you hover over top. So we'll do something like a gray, right? And I'm also going to change the blend mode to multiply. That'll allow, let me turn off the color change. That'll allow us to see through this layer while also allowing the hover effect to work. And then the color change, what we're going to do here is we're going to change this to a nice bright blue, but we want to change the blend mode of this to saturation. And you can start to see what's kind of happening here, right? It's not there yet, but with a few little changes, we should be able to get there, right? And we're going to change the layer order a little bit so that certain things like our profile photo is not affected in this case, right? We can also change the color here. Maybe we'll add a little bit of blue in here, right? Something like that. Now, how do we actually get this thing to work, right? So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to take both these layers and create a component. So again, Command and Control K, and we'll call this hover. And then in the initial state, we don't want any of this to be seen, right? So we're going to have the color change layer basically hidden, but we want one of the layers to be still visible, but also not visible. And if we were to simply hide it, as you can see there, the bounds of this component are basically 0, which we don't want, because then we won't be able to trigger it. So we're going to actually keep it turned on, but we're going to take the opacity and bring it down to 0. And you can see that the bounds are still around that container, which is exactly what we want, right? Now, the next thing we want is we want to create that hover state. So I'm going to press the plus button, create a hover state. We can call it hover state. And then in here, we want to, take the opacity of the background layer up to 100. And then we want to turn the color change layer on, right? Just like that. Now, if you were to go back to our default state and play it, there's a little bit of a delay, right? It looks okay, but there's a little bit of a delay. And that's where you can go into prototype mode. Here's our hover state. We're going to change the type to transition with no animation. That'll allow this hover state to kick off immediately, as you can see right here, right? And the importance of that is when we have multiple rows going down this table, we'll be able to very easily just kind of move down and all the hover states will kick off really nicely. Now, I mentioned earlier, if I switch over to the hover state, we may not want all of these layers to be affected by the, by the hover, right? So things like I think the actions might be okay, but the label, or at least the user, we might want that to be above, right? There we go. And that can be changed, that's fine. Those are good. And possibly, we might want the text to actually change. So we might want to actually move this back out underneath the hover, or this one will be above the hover. This one would be below. That way we can have that text change like that. And that could be okay there. That could work, right? And we can definitely experiment with our color change to get the exact color that we're looking for, right? But I think this could work. Yeah, that could work. I think if we mess with the background a little bit, keep it nice and subtle. There we go. So now if we press play, we now have our hover. And what's nice is we still can activate our toggle in the background, which is great. All right, so we have our first row looking pretty good. And now what we want to do is we want to create several rows going down this table so we can start adding in some additional content. And knowing we're going to have several rows, we're also going to want to create a component out of this entire row. So even though we have our hover state inside of here, we also have our labels, we have all sorts of different things. We're going to definitely want to create a component of the entire row. I'm also going to just remove the background, or remove the padding at the bottom. There we go. And one more thing that we might want to add inside this row before we move on is a very subtle border, right? We're just going to add a little bit of a border at the bottom. Just like that. Now it's hard to see. Oh, I put in the wrong. There we go. Ooh, that's not what I wanted. I think I selected the wrong tool. There we go. Drag that across. Now, of course, you're noticing that because of the rounded corners, we have a little bit of weirdness going on here. So we might actually want to go back and increase the padding at the bottom of our table just a little bit. There we go. Hop over here and make some quick changes. That could work, right? Another option would to actually be bring this in so it lines up with the elements. And then we won't have to worry about that padding at the bottom. So either way will work, completely up to you. But the nice thing is now that we're going to be creating a component of this entire row, we can make those changes just once and it'll push it everywhere. So Command or Control K to create our row. Now you might think, well, we can just duplicate this down, right? And you're not completely wrong, but to make it a little bit easier, and especially for thinking about, rearranging this in the future, we might want to put this row into a larger group and then turn stacks on. So I'm going to go ahead and Command and Control G. I'm going to call this rows. And then within the properties inspector, we're going to turn a stack on. Now, because there's only technically one object, in that case, the row component inside of this stack, it defined it as a horizontal stack. But in this case, we want a vertical stack. So I'm going to switch it over. And now I can select the row and duplicate, right? And I can have as many of these going down as I need to, and it's going to automatically resize. Now I'm noticing that the border that we created is making it a little bit misaligned, right? We can also bring this up a little bit, holding down Shift. Actually, it doesn't look too bad. I think that lines up, actually. Awesome. But the nice thing is, we have our main component down here, which I'm going to swivel up to the top. We probably don't need as many right now. We can start one at a time. But if we needed to, we can always dive into the main component, make changes, and it's going to automatically push those changes, right? Which is great. All right, so we're going to dive in here, and we're going to start making some changes. I'm going to pull some names from the chat. So this will be Wade. And then we definitely want our new profile photo. It doesn't look like Wade. I'm going to go for something a little bit more generic. And Wade might be a product manager. Maybe I'll change product manager to a nice green. I'm going to drop the color a little bit. Something like that. And then Wade will be from, let's say, Miami, Florida. Wade, what is your favorite typeface? For now, I'm going to just put Papyrus. Because why not, right? But go ahead and let me know in the chat. And I'm going to start, oh, Sam's there, and Kasoon. Duplicate. Sam's going to be nice and pink. And then Sam is going to be an engineer. And we'll change the background color to, what should engineers be? Maybe blue? Something like that. There we go. And, oops. Ooh, what am I doing? Duplicate. Ooh, ice cream. That's a good one. So I'm going to do that one for Kasoon. Oops. There we go. And we'll put green. I'm not sure where Kasoon is from, but I'm going to just put in, let's say, Denver, Colorado, one of my favorite places. And ice cream. There we go. All right, we are making progress. I'm going to put one more. Just because. Who else is in here? Let's see. Jennifer. Oh, and notice I didn't change this email address. Go, and we'll keep Jennifer a designer. And then another location. London, UK, and then one more typeface, Helvetic. All right, so we are making progress on this. Let me actually bring this down. That looks pretty good, actually. It's getting there, right? Nabil is saying, use my location. Okay, one more. And then we're going to move on. We're going to talk about responsive resize a little bit. And Nabil, while I'm doing this, where are you from? So I can put in your location. If you want to disclose that, of course. And now, one thing that I didn't do in this case is on the main component of this particular element here. So if I go ahead and edit the main component, right? We have it as a component, but if you know that you're going to be having just like a set amount of positions, and you can actually create different states. So one state could be, let's say, an engineer, right? And I'm going to go ahead and engineer, and we'll use a different color for this, maybe the blue, right? And then we'll have another state, product manager. And then we'll change the color of this. I think I used the green of some sort, right? So this will just help save a little bit of time. So you have your default state, which is designer, engineer, product manager. You can have a few of these. That way, as you're going through and you're assigning roles or positions to people, right? You can just select those positions from your states just to make it a little bit easier, right? So Nabil is saying for the location, there we go. And I'll need a typeface, but I'll just go ahead and put in, oops. What's another typeface we can use? Avenir. There we go. And Jennifer says Boston, Massachusetts. Boston. And there we go. All right. So our table's looking pretty good, right? It definitely could use a little bit of tweaking, but I think for the most part, it works. Now, I know a lot of you wanted to talk about a little bit of responsive resize. Now, by default, it doesn't do a terrible job, right? But one thing you might want to do is you might want to dive into certain elements, and especially in the main components, right? And just make sure that things are kind of locked. So if you go ahead and select your, let's say your label, right? Over within the properties inspector, you can control the responsive resize, right? So you can make sure that things are fixed both width and height. That way your labels don't change size as you're resizing. And you can also, fix the position too. So if you want it to remain on the top or the bottom or the left or the right or whatever it might be, you can just go ahead and, lock that there. So that way when you are, making changes, right? It'll do that, right? Now, of course, you want to go through and do the same thing for your labels at the top, right? So certain things you'll want to kind of, fix into place. Now, my suggestion is, use this section at the far right-hand corner to kind of move a little bit, and then use everything else, because you probably don't want, if you make this smaller, you don't want your location to kind of overlap with this information. So I'm going to dive in here, select the location, make sure it's fixed over to the left, do the same thing with this. Guess I have to move over a little bit. Actually, you know what? I'm going to move this over this way a touch. Move this over a touch as well. I'm going to make sure this is fixed. Ideally, I'd be using guides and grids and all that fun stuff, but there we go, right? Now, of course, there's no way at the moment to have it stop when you get to a location like this, but, it works, right? Now, of course, if you wanted to make it larger, then you would probably ignore some of those fixed positions, right? So I can turn that off, and then if I make this larger, those will kind of move around with it, right? So there's a few different ways you can do it. All right, let's take a quick look. And now we have all of our hover, and we also have our checkboxes that we can turn on or off in no particular order because we used toggle states. Jennifer says this is where the fun that is CSS comes in. Yes. And of course that's a whole other conversation. Definitely talk with your engineers and your other, front-end designers to make sure that you're all on the same page and you can definitely, do what you're designing, right? And I guess the last thing before we wrap things up, we can now dive in, maybe add a few interactions on this section here, or at least maybe some hover, because we kind of have something going on, but we might want something a little bit different. So let's say the menu, for example, right? We might want to turn this into a component. Now, when I do that, Command and Control K, you're going to notice it turns it into an instance of the main component. And that's because it's already inside of a larger component, right? So we're going to want to make sure to edit that main component, which is this little tiny guy down here. Now, to make my life a little bit easier, what I'm going to do is just move it on top of the existing menu, just so we can kind of line things up a little bit. And possibly when we maybe click on this menu, right, it might pop out another kind of like a container, right? So there's a few action items that you can click on immediately, but then you might want to access some more, right? So if I go ahead and press the plus button, maybe we'll create a toggle state. And if I dive in here, we can create something like this. Now, of course, I haven't thought this out very well, so definitely think out your designs a little bit better than I have, right? People add a little bit of a border here, maybe add a touch of a drop shadow. Again, might be getting into the territory of too many drop shadows, but we're gonna, ooh, that is not looking nice. No, don't like that at all. Add a little bit of color in there, drop the opacity quite a bit, maybe to about 8. It's looking a little bit better. I'm still not loving whatever that is, right? And of course, it depends on what other actions you're going to have in here. So if I, just as argument's sake, we're going to just draw out a few ellipses. And these will be our actions. Something like that, right? Yeah, I don't like the way it looks, but we're gonna run with it. All right, and the nice thing, like the toggle state earlier, is we have our default state and we have our toggle state, right? Now, of course, one thing that we should definitely talk about a little bit is because we have a very small element, basically this layer here has 3 tiny little dots, it can be very difficult to actually click on, right? So what you'll want to do in your default state, just dive in here, grab a rectangle, and just add a bit of a hot spot, right? Move it to the back. And then just turn the opacity down to 0. That way it's still there, and it's still part of the overall layer. That way, when you go ahead and play one more time, you have a much easier time selecting, right? And you can probably also, convert this into an X to close, right? Because right now it just looks like the menu icon is still there. So there's a lot of little things you have to think about when you're creating interactions like this that we just don't have time in like 1 minute, right? And we can also create maybe a hover state. And possibly these will change color when you're hovering over top of them. Right, so we have our hover state, so it turns blue a little bit. I still think they're a little bit too small. But the nice thing is, because this is the main component in here for the row, where did our actions go? Here they are. You're noticing down below, they're updating everywhere, which is wonderful. Let's make these a little bit larger. Just a tiny bit larger. go. It's not great, but it'll work, right? Looks a little bit better. And again, because we edited that main component, we now have this effect everywhere, right? Now, of course, we'll probably have to go in to our main component and move the actions above the hover so we don't get that weird color change, right? But there we go. All right. That's going to wrap things up for me for today. Hope you all enjoyed this. Hope you learned something new. Kyle T. Webster is coming up in just a few moments. Make sure to follow me on all the different platforms, and I will see you all next week. Thanks, everyone.